Good morning, everybody. This is Jim Tobin with NHB's Government Affairs team. Sitting next to me is Scott Meyer, who's going to kick off our briefing session in a couple of minutes with our top issue. But I want to give everybody, we're going to let everybody know that we'll get a couple more minutes. We have, how many people we got on? We have close to 50 people on board. So I'll just slowly introduce our day. Thank you again for joining us for our third installment of NHB's Bringing Housing Home Week, where we allow you to be the conduit for our grassroots campaigns out in the district. Without an NHB board meeting in D.C. this year, this is our best opportunity to bring the issues that are important to the housing industry to lawmakers all across the country. And equally important is this year because it's an election year, and there's a lot of consequences with those the November elections coming up. Not only making sure that the new candidates who are on the ballots understand housing issues and we elect pro-housing candidates, but also those who are trying to return to Congress to make sure that they understand that that housing is 15% of the GDP, and there's a lot of issues before Congress that can help the housing industry continue to reach its stride and build all those single-family and multifamily units that we need to meet pent-up demand. So I just want to say thank you for participating next week. I know the staff, and myself included, are looking forward to coming out and visiting with you across the country and joining in this great effort. So with that, I want to be able to just kick off the briefings portion of the morning with my colleague Scott Meyer, who's going to walk you through an issue that's near and dear to our hearts here and is equally important and one we've been working on, and you have as well for a long time, and that's reform of the GSEs, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So, Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. Again, I wanted to brief everybody this morning on the legislative debate surrounding the future of the U.S. housing finance system, specifically, as Jim referenced, what should be done to reform the housing government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, as well as the Federal Housing Administration. Now, as you all know, the debate has been going on for many years, but it's important for us to remember why this is so critical to our industry. So let me offer a little background. The GSEs themselves were created by Congress to support mortgage market liquidity and help address overall affordable housing needs. Now, for years, the GSEs have operated with an implicit government backing that allows them to raise funds at favorable rates, which ultimately benefits mortgage borrowers. But as we know, unfortunately, during the downturn in 2008, the GSEs themselves were found to have serious accounting issues, which required them to be placed in the government conservatorship until Congress could pass a long-term solution. And nobody in Washington expected that conservatorship would last quite as long as it has. Now, with the government ultimately supporting 9 out of every 10 home loans, it's a good thing that the government did step in to keep the mortgage markets liquid when the private markets evaporated during a downturn. Nevertheless, the fact remains that conservatorship itself is not a long-term solution. Conservatorship provides zero certainty to the housing market on overall access to mortgage credit. And with all the decisions now being made by one unelected regulator, the housing market needs the certainty that a reform bill would provide. Mortgage credit cannot swing back and forth depending on the whims of any particular administration. So much like in years past, the legislative battle now continues in Congress on the future of the GSEs. And while we're winning the overall debate, we have to continue to keep up the pressure on our elected officials until a reform bill is signed into law. So quick, what type of reform does NHB support, and what do we want to preserve in the current system? Well, first, NHB does not want to simply preserve the status quo. In fact, we've made recommendations over the last several years to Congress outlining a plan by which Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be gradually phased into a private sector-oriented system where government's role is clear, but its exposure is limited. And we believe that federal support should be limited only to catastrophic situations where carefully calibrated levels of private capital and insurance reserves are depleted before any taxpayer funds are employed to shore up the mortgage market. And we also support steps to increase the role of private capital in the U.S. housing finance system, but we do not believe that the market can rely exclusively on these private sources. History clearly shows the limitations of the private mortgage market, During bad times, private market evaporates, leaving qualified buyers high and dry in the housing market in a free fall. Indeed, in the aftermath of the housing downturn, investors have been reluctant to invest in mortgage securities without this key federal backing. And Wall Street expects that this share would shrink dramatically without a federal backstop. And NHB believes federal support is particularly important to the continuing availability of a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. So NHB seeks to preserve a limited federal backstop, but where does this stand in Congress currently? Well, for the first time in a long time, we now have key chairmen in both houses of Congress, as well as the administration itself, on the same page on the GSE reform issue. And importantly, we no longer have to fight against harmful legislation that would fully dismantle this all-important government support that I just talked about. In fact, as I'll explain shortly, NHB recently won that battle with years of strong advocacy, educating members of Congress during countless meetings here in D.C., as well as in-district meetings during previous Bringing Housing Home efforts on the need for this federal backing. So first, more on that important victory. As you remember, for years, NHB had to fight against legislation in the House of Representatives called the PATH Act that would have ended the all-important government support for Fannie and Freddie. And we were successful in keeping that legislation from moving to the House floor. After years of opposition, however, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman Jeb Hensarling from Texas, made a public announcement last December indicating that any legislation that moves forward this Congress would need to be both bipartisan and include an explicit government guarantee. He made it clear during this conversation that this concession was due to lack of support among enough House members to move that bill to the House floor and ultimately to the President's desk. Now, in the Senate, NHB has long worked with a small group of key Senate Banking Committee members who have worked together themselves in a bipartisan fashion to find a middle ground on this issue. And NHB has long been very supportive of their efforts. One of those members is now the chairman of the full Senate Banking Committee, Senator Mike Crapo from Idaho, and he is seeking a similar compromise in the committee this year. Now, with all the gridlock in Congress, this is not going to be easy to accomplish. So while we have much work to do to advance bipartisan reform legislation, we are winning the battle. But we need to keep pressing our message with our elected representatives to pass comprehensive reform that continues to provide a backstop for reliable and adequate flow of affordable housing credit in all economic and financial conditions. Now, whether this happens this year or next, our elected officials need to be constantly reminded and educated on why this is important to our industry. Thank you, and that's it for GSE reform, and right now I'll pass it to my colleague Alexis for an update on immigration and labor.
Good morning. So where labor shortages continue to be a huge issue for the construction sector, last year nearly 2/3 of respondents to an NAHB survey indicated that they were still facing labor shortages or shortages of contractors and subcontractors. As we're reaching close to full employment, which economists estimate to be something below 4%, we're currently 4.1% unemployment nationally. Employers are finding it harder and harder to source domestic qualified labor for construction positions. So on the sheets that you've seen for Bring Housing Home, you can see workforce and immigration are listed together because this is holistically an issue of labor, not just immigration from the standpoint of people coming in from foreign countries to become American citizens, but immigration from the standpoint of foreign labor programs. So I'll start on the domestic side. The priority for Bringing Housing Home is really messaging to members of Congress that labor shortages continue to be a huge issue in the construction sector. There's this perception currently that construction has largely not recovered yet from the economic downturn. There's still workers sitting on the bench looking for jobs. That is just not the case. So conveying to members of Congress in your meetings what these shortages translate into, and that's higher housing costs, low inventory, increased home prices, and difficulties completing projects on time, and holistically in the end, lower economic growth. There is no one magical solution to fix the worker shortage, but there are some bills that we are supporting as NAHB and promoting during Bring Housing Home next week. There's a huge interest by Congress in addressing non-traditional populations and how employers can reach out to them to get workers, and that includes veterans, at-risk youth, the incarcerated or formerly incarcerated individuals as well. So really talking about that in the context of labor shortages and anything that you are doing to reach out to those groups is very important. There are also are bills like the Perkins Act reauthorization for career and technical education. In a rare showing of bipartisan support these days, that bill passed the House several months ago by voice vote, not even a recorded vote. Unfortunately, it's still sitting in the Senate. This bill really aligns CTE programs and focuses them better on in-demand industries like construction. So in your meetings with senators, strongly encourage them to take up the House-passed bill or to act on CTE reauthorization so that the programs can be reflective of the current economy. We also support continued funding in programs like Job Corps and Youth Build and other Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. So encouraging your members in both the House and Senate to support sustained, if not increased, funding for these programs. That is a vital message to convey as well in your meetings. Additionally, there's an interesting bill that popped up this year, the Higher Ed reauthorization, something that traditionally we wouldn't have any stake in. The most recent reauthorization of that bill, the PROSPER Act, H.R. 4508, includes the creation of a Pell Grant program for low-income individuals to pursue workforce education, so earn and learn opportunities. And while I know in a lot of cases employers do pay for the materials for a lot of these trainees, this is a great step in the direction of recognizing earn and learn career paths as equal to a four-year college pursuit and ensuring that they are treated the same way for purposes of grants and funding opportunities. So we are supportive of that bill. It's in the House and has not been voted on by the full House of Representatives. So do speak with your members of Congress in the House in these meetings and encourage them to bring that bill to the floor for a vote. Turning towards the foreign labor side, from the immigration perspective, it's been a very contentious environment on immigration. We still have not reached a solution on the DACA program, and it's unlikely that there will be any major immigration legislation in the remaining months of this year. But we are still advocating for programs that are beneficial to the construction labor force, and that includes, addressing current workers who are here through temporary protected status and advocating for those individuals who are typically from Honduras, El Salvador, and Haiti, many of whom are in the construction sector, for their status to be extended by the Department of Homeland Security so that they can continue living and working in the United States. This DHS had sunset that program, or sunset the status for several countries in that program recently, and that would mean that people who are legally authorized to work in the United States would be sent home to their home countries. So when you are meeting with your members of Congress, do encourage them to pursue extension of TPS status for these countries. Additionally, the expansion of guest workers continues to be a priority. I know a number of construction businesses have turned to the H-2B temporary worker program. As I mentioned, this is not immigration in the context of bringing people here to live and become residents. This is what I like to call a labor program, not an immigration program. It allows companies to bring temporary foreign labor in on a seasonal basis to complete peak work for up to a period of 9 months, and then they go home back to their home countries. They pay into the American tax system. They buy American goods, and at the end of the day, they go back to their home countries. It should be a non-controversial program, but it still is, despite that, because of perceptions of what it actually does and people overstaying. In fact, it's a very safe program, and people adhere to the legal constraints of it. So there used to be a returning worker exemption for this that didn't count workers coming in from years prior. Now that exemption is expired, individuals who are in on the program. There's only 66,000 visas allotted each year, which means businesses who've traditionally relied on this program are finding trouble getting those workers in. The most recent omnibus bill did grant DHS the ability to raise the cap, but we're not hopeful that it will do anything significant for the remainder of the year. So our ask is twofold. One, for in the Senate to co-sponsor and advance the Save Our Small and Seasonal Businesses Act, which would restore that returning worker exemption. That's S792. And in the House, it's co-sponsoring and advancing the Season Act, HR 2004, which would do something similar. So that kind of sums up the workforce component of our presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Alex Strong on our team for an update on the regulations and softwood part.
Thank you, Alexis. I appreciate it. As Alexis mentioned, my name is Alex Strong, and I'm the Federal Legislative Director who is going to talk to you today about regulatory reform and the ongoing softwood lumber crisis. First off, on regulatory reform, I always like to start this by mentioning the most compelling figure in this discussion, courtesy of our economic shop, and that is that 25% of the cost of a new single-family home built for sale is attributable to government regulation. That's about $85,000 on the typical single-family home. This is a jaw-dropping statistic for members of Congress to hear. They have really no concept of the cumulative effect of regulations on our industry. And so that it's incumbent upon us to both educate them and to encourage them to take steps to reduce the regulatory burden on our industry. You will no doubt have heard a great deal in the news about the successes and the active work of the Trump administration in rolling back the regulatory state. Arguably, this is one of the areas where the administration has been most effective in pursuing its agenda. Still, for all they've done, and NHB has been the beneficiary of much of this work, including rolling back the OSHA Volks record-keeping regulation and the onerous Waters of the United States rulemaking. But for all of this work, it's little more than playing whack-a-mole with these regulations that are popping up. What we really want to do is address the underlying problem, and that is a broken regulatory rulemaking state, and coupled with the fact that over many decades, members of Congress have ceded their oversight authority over these regulatory rulemaking agencies. So what can we do? NHB believes there are three keys to fixing the problem, and we've supported legislation in this Congress and previous Congresses to address the problem. What we believe is key to this is restoring, as I mentioned, this is probably the most important component of the fix, and that is to restore congressional oversight authority. Currently, unelected bureaucrats in Washington populate these rulemaking agencies and come up with the new rules with little to no oversight or final say from the duly elected members of Congress. We want to change that. Additionally, we want to ensure that future rulemakings adequately address or understand, rather, the unique burden small businesses face when complying with regulations. Finally, as I mentioned, the process itself is broken. Much of this is done behind closed doors, little transparency, little sound science and data to back up the rulemakings, and we want to address that issue as well. As I mentioned, NHB has been a leader in Washington in supporting efforts to address these problems that I've mentioned, and we have key voted legislation that is passed the House of Representatives. So much of your focus next week is going to be on pushing members of the U.S. Senate to support existing companion legislation, and I'll take them in turn. Specifically, supporting
Senate Bill 21. This is the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act. Again, as I mentioned, this is arguably the most important component of the regulatory reform agenda. And what it would do, what that piece of legislation would do, is return final control of rulemaking, passage, and implementation to members of Congress, those elected by the American public. We believe this is the right thing to do and the best way to restore accountability to the rulemaking process. Second, we want members of the Senate to support Senate Bill 584, the Small Business Regulatory Flexibility Improvements Act. This, as the name suggests, is a piece of legislation that would add additional power to the Small Business Office of Advocacy to advocate on behalf of small businesses in the rulemaking process and to ensure that the least cost alternatives, particularly for small businesses, are considered when new regulations are being promulgated. Finally, we'd like to have members of the Senate support Senate Bill 951, that is the Regulatory Accountability Act. And this is a massive undertaking that completely overhauls the regulatory rulemaking system, which in fact hasn't been updated since 1946. So many of the changes in there, as I mentioned earlier, would go towards bringing this process out into the sunlight, towards adding opportunity for public feedback, and again, using more sound science and data in the rulemaking process to ensure that we don't get bad rules out of this process in the future. So, aside from just asking your members of the Senate to support these measures, we need a concerted push on moderate Democrats in the Senate and on those who are up for re-election this year in vulnerable states that President Trump carried. I'm talking, of course, about folks on the moderate Dems. We'd want particular attention on folks like Doug Jones in Alabama, the Angus Kings in Maine, Mark Warner in Virginia, and those with races. We're talking about Bill Nelson in Florida, Mr. Donnelly in Indiana, McCaskill in Missouri, Heitkamp in North Dakota. We're really going to need approximately 9 Democrats across the aisle to be able to move this legislation, and we're right there. We're close, but those last few inches are going to be very difficult. I certainly won't lie to you. So, with that, I'm happy to take, as everybody is, happy to take questions at the end. But that's all I have for regulatory reform. And I wish you the best of luck in those meetings. Next, I want to move on and talk to you about softwood lumber and what's been going on with that. No doubt, if you haven't heard or you haven't read national news or NHB Now's blog with all the postings we've done about the ongoing trade dispute over softwood lumber with Canada, then certainly you will know about it, and our members will know about it by virtue of a trip to the lumber yard. I mean, your prices are likely through the roof. Most members are reporting increases in their lumber packages in the north of 30% increase. So it is significant, and this increase is owed to 20% tariffs that are currently in place on imports of Canadian softwood lumber to the United States. The effect of this it should be obvious to all. It's driving volatility in the lumber market, and it is bringing about never before seen lumber prices. In early March of this year, a key index for framing lumber reached a level we've never seen before, a record high of $512 per thousand board feet. This is obviously directly affecting housing affordability, and it's pricing out working class families out of the market for owning a home. So why is this having such a dramatic effect on the lumber markets, and what can we do, and what should we be doing next week when we meet with our members of Congress? Well, the reason why it's having such a significant effect on the lumber markets is owed to the fundamental underlying factor, that is, we regularly consume more lumber as a nation than we produce. So we have to go get that, we have to go make up for that gap by getting lumber somewhere else. And it turns out that Canada provides about 93 to 96% of that lumber to fill our consumption gap. So any tariffs or any artificial trade barriers placed on lumber coming from Canada is going to throw those markets into disarray. And again, as I've suggested, that's what we are seeing, and it is dramatically affecting the price of lumber and, again, the affordability of housing by extension. So the question is, what can we do? What can our members of Congress do to help this situation? First and foremost, the administration needs to get back to the bargaining table with Canada to work out a new softwood lumber agreement. This will bring stability to the lumber markets and ensure certainty for the future of the lumber markets. What we would like to have you do is have your members of Congress reach out to the administration, particularly the Secretary of Commerce and the ambassador, the U.S. trade representative, with a letter requesting that they, again, go back to the table and renegotiate a softwood lumber agreement. We will be providing you with a draft letter, so you can hand this directly to your member of Congress when you sit down with them and talk about the issue. And we greatly appreciate that. Again, that will be coming, if not later today, then early tomorrow. You should look for that. The other prong of our approach to this problem is, again, addressing the underlying problem, that is, we consume more than we produce. So, either you go get the lumber somewhere else, or you produce more of it yourself. So on that latter point, we would like to see the U.S. increase again its domestic production of timber, particularly off federal lands. Back up until the late 80s and early 90s, we were producing in the neighborhood of 1/5 of all of our lumber production off federally owned forests. That plummeted in the mid-1990s. The confluence of regulatory red tape and litigation on our nation's forestry professionals has conspired to reduce that haul of federal lands. And so we want to work with our members of Congress and the administration to see where we can improve the health of our existing forests, while also, as an ancillary benefit, increasing our domestic haul of lumber. And to that end, we've already seen some success. The omnibus spending measure that passed earlier this year contained a number of NHB-supported forestry reforms, but there's still more that can be done. So we need members of Congress to be reaching out to the administration, particularly to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Interior, to take necessary steps to once again increase our domestic timber harvest. I appreciate the time today. Wish you the best of luck next week. And again, I'll be around just as everyone for questions after this. So thank you, and I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Jessica Hall.
Thanks, Alex. So we'll be covering flood insurance. So after a number of short-term extensions, the National Flood Insurance Program is set to expire on July 31st. As a reminder, due to your congressional mandate, all structures built within the 100-year floodplain and have a federally backed mortgage must carry flood insurance. The private market is currently not active in many states, and but even then, it's commonly paired with NFIP policy. Because of that, the NFIP is the only affordable flood insurance program nationwide and is commonly used as primary insurance for single-family and in a first loss position for multifamily and commercial structures. Last year, the House released their draft bill that included language that would have essentially prevented new construction from accessing the NFIP and eliminated grandfathered properties. NHB was the only outside organization to fight this negative new construction provision, and thanks in large part to your efforts last year at LegCon, we were successful. We cut a deal with committee leadership and now support the House NFIP package. It was largely due to NHB support that a number of other outside groups jumped on board, and with some minor tweaks to appeal to leadership, the House passed their bill last November. But unfortunately, we've come to a complete stop in the Senate. The House package was always too conservative to bring up in the Senate, but they have at least 3 of their own bills, all of which NHB would support. However, after 2 broad hearings on NFIP in the Senate, there's no indication that they will bring one of their bills forward for a vote. Prior to 2012, we saw a number of short-term extensions, but unfortunately, short-term extensions also lead to short-term lapses. We need to ensure that NFIP has a long-term reauthorization to prevent any accidental lapses from happening to the program. If the NFIP lapses, home closings in the 100-year floodplain will be delayed or canceled, and FEMA will be severely limited in the amount of funds they can use to help flood-related disasters. During this year's Bringing Housing Home, tell your senators to urge their leadership, and particularly Banking Committee Chairman Crapo, to move forward a long-term NFIP reauthorization bill. And tell your representatives to continue working with their leadership and senators to ensure we have a long-term solution before the July 31st deadline. I know you've all heard about this for the last probably 2 years, so if you have any additional questions, we'll answer those at the end, and turn to Paul with our NHB portal.
Oh, other direction, other direction. More. There we go. Keep going. All right, guys, home stretch. I promise you, I'm going to make this fairly quick. As you guys go into battle and you need the tools to make this happen, I just want to make sure that all of you know about a very cool new product that we launched back at IBS. It's called the Housing Portal. I think, Jill, are you going to put that up for us now? Okay, can you go back one slide just to be sure? All right, I have no way to control this. Okay, so nhb.org/portal. In January, we launched this tool that's almost custom made for this event for you guys. So as you know, NHB has a lot of data, and we have a lot of polling information. So we've kind of concised everything into a nice, neat package into this. You can go to nhb.org/portal to find it. And you can see on the front page that you're seeing right now, you can either look at the overview, which has some of the key legislative issues that we're fighting right now, economic and polling information. Can you go on to the next slide? There you go. You have some information right there. Nice, clean, concise. Go on to the next slide, please. Now, what makes this very cool and very interesting for you guys is rather than stopping at the national level, what we did was oversampled every state in the country to make sure that we had enough data to represent every state in the nation. So as you can see now on the front page, you have a map, and you also have a drop-down. And if you click on that, and let's pick Texas. So let's move to the next slide, please. Now, everything on that page deals with Texas. Every piece of information, every polling data, all that now is Texas specific. So now you can go to your senator and you don't have to play the, well, this is what the national is telling us, or here's information on the national level. This is stuff that now you can use at the Texas level. So if you go on to the next slide, please. You can see there that we have information not only on single family and starts, but we also have some information on rental and multifamily data as well. Next slide, please. And then all the polling information as well now becomes state-centric. Keep going. And the thing that we decided was, well, if we already are hitting the state level, wouldn't it be cool if we would now take it to the congressional district level? So that's what we did for you guys. So if you go back to that state page, down below there you can see that there you can now go by district. So let's say we chose District 10 in Texas. Next slide. So now all the polling information and all the data that you see is now for each district that, each district is represented. Sorry, I just chewed that up. But if you keep going, so two critical things now, and two very fun tools. Every page below has an action button. So if you can send this page to your membership, and what they can do is down below there'll be a specific action that we're requesting your members take advantage of. So every page right now has a button below it that says, please contact your congressman and talk about the Canadian lumber issue. It's easy as clicking that button. It takes you to a page where you type in your zip code, and it'll fill in your congressional information. Now, what's beneficial for you guys, as you go into battle, is there's also a report button on almost every page. So if you go, let's go into the next slide. If you click that button, what you get is a PDF version of all the data and all the polling data that you were just seeing. So you can print that out, and you can use it as a leave behind. You can use it as a cheat sheet as you move forward. You can use it however way you want, but it's all in a nice, neat package that you don't have to think about. You just click report, and then you can either send it electronically via PDF, or you can print it out without any issues. Next slide. So that's it for me. That's the portal. I hope you guys use it. And again, this is not behind any firewall or anything, so anybody can use it. You can either tell your congressman, go to nhb.org/portal and find the information that we're talking to you about here. You can send it to members. You can put it on your different newsletters and different publications. That's it. Thank you.
All right, Jill, we can close out of that presentation if you can. All right, I'm Michael Bezruki. I'm NHB's Director of Grassroots Programs. I wanted to thank you for joining us for today's webinar and for participating in Bringing Housing Home. At this point in time, we'll take any questions that you have. I know a couple have come in during the presentation. First, Carol asks, can we get data backing up the statistic that nearly 25% of the cost of building a new single-family home is attributable to government regulation? Carol, yeah, I'm familiar with that statistic. 25% is on the national average. If you're looking for one specific to New Jersey, we can provide that to you. We have the economic model, and we can do it state by state as well. And so taking the average cost and attributing the actual cost of regulation. So we can send that to you after the conclusion of this webinar. Any additional questions? George asks, where are we with the contribution to aid and construction for private water companies? Should we address this during our meeting? I think that we'll have the lobbyist that handles this issue follow up with you after the call, George. He's not in attendance today, but we can look into that for you. And he'll give you instructions for specific legislators for the meetings as well. So. All right. Seeing no further questions, we'll move to wrap up now. We'll follow up with George and Carol. Carol, I've been told that we can put up the link for that statistic as well in the chat so other callers can see it now. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us, and please visit the NHB advocacy page for any questions about Bringing Housing Home or to contact our staff for assistance and questions. Thank you again.